This video is made possible by Vincero Watches, luxury handcrafted watches at fair prices. Now their biggest sale ever is going on right now. You can check it out through the link below. In the first 2 years of World War II, the Allies were stunned by the speed, coordination, and efficacy of Germany's armored divisions. They were seemingly unstoppable. This was the success of Blitzkrieg tactics, or lightning war. This success was attributed to the leadership and the military genius of today's protagonist. Even before the war, his published works had brought him to the attention of military leaders worldwide. He became known as the father of Blitzkrieg. His loyalty to Germany, it was undisputed, but his support of Hitler and the Nazi leadership, it was not so clear-cut. He was, in fact, one of the very few generals who dared shouting back at the Führer and even disobeying his orders. So join me today as we look at the story of General Heinz Guderian. Before we dive bomb like a Stucker into Heinz Guderian's life, I will bore you with some military theory, as we do need to clarify some concepts. Blitzkrieg tactics can be defined as the use of combined forces of tanks, motorized infantry, and artillery, breaking the opponent's defenses on a narrow front, bypassing pockets of resistance, and striking deep into enemy territory. Ground forces are provided close support by the Air Force, tasked with bombing key objectives and establishing local air superiority. The term Blitzkrieg was actually coined by the British press, not by the German High Command, as a means to describe the swift invasion of Poland in September of 1939. German military would have used the term Bewungungskrieg. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm doing my best. My pronunciation dictionary didn't know that one. Or also in English, something I can pronounce, war of movement. And it's a military doctrine rather than a tactic. A tactic is a method of employing forces in combat, or the how of how you can win a battle. Military doctrine is the set of principles by which the armed forces are organized. Doctrine shapes strategies, which are the plans to achieve victory in any war. And I really hope I got all of that right. If any of you have served or are serving in the military, please do feel free to correct me in the comments. But going back to the Bewungungskrieg, this doctrine had been shaping the German armed forces' plans since World War I. Heinz Guderian and other military theorists after him perfected the doctrine and took advantage of current technology to maximize the potential of its theoretical principles. So rather than calling Guderian the father of Blitzkrieg, he should be rather the optimizer of Bewungungskrieg. And that is definitely less catchy. But with that out of the way, let's begin with the life of Heinz. Heinz Guderian was born on the 7th of June 1888 in Kulm in Prussia, which is now Polish territory. He was born into a close-knit family with a long-standing military tradition. His father, Friedrich, had been a colonel in the Prussian, then the German army. Heinz followed his father's career enthusiastically as a teenager and enlisted in the Principal Cadet School in Berlin. He was an ambitious and determined student. His teachers described him as being always serious. But that wasn't always the case, because sometimes he was also described as very serious. Heinz soon gained a useful leadership skill, and that's the ability of speaking very concisely and clearly to communicate his ideas and later his orders. At will, he could turn his communication style into one that was cold and hurting. This made him equally famous and feared at the cadet school, but not very popular. It appears he made no friends there, at least until he graduated and got his first command post. In 1907, at the age of 19, Heinz was sent to join the 10th Battalion as second lieutenant under the command of his father. We don't know if this was by design, but we do know that Heinz did not take advantage of the situation and slouch around. Friedrich Guderian was a stern leader, both loved and feared by his soldiers and his families, and he would not make any favors for his son. Heinz worked hard and learned a great deal from his father. 2 years later, Heinz Guderian's unit was transferred to the Goslar barracks in the Harz Mountains, one of the most scenic parts of Germany. He had some time to go horse riding, hunting, and did some socializing. And that was when he met and fell in love with Marguerite Gurn, whom he nicknamed Gretel. Gretel was the perfect companion for Heinz, as she shared and supported his ambitious outlook on life. They would marry in 1913, and Heinz later described her as the perfect soldier's wife. She could be cool and sensible when needed, and most of the time she was able to calm her husband husband when he was seized by his frequent fits of anger. Very often in his later life, Guderian's hot temper got him into trouble for lashing out at subordinates and superiors alike. On many occasions, he had to be saved from disciplinary measures by a superior who appreciated his exceptional military ability despite his poor impulse control. Later in life, Guderian took snap decisions to disobey orders from above. He clearly had a talent for leading, he just couldn't be bothered with any following. The year before his wedding, 1912, Heinz wanted to broaden his technical training, and so he transferred to the 3rd Telegraph Battalion. Here he studied hard to become a specialist in the new radio signal equipment. Already at this stage, he saw communications as a decisive element for military victory. His studies were not limited to the radio. He studied military strategy in French and English so that he could study military theory textbooks in those languages. His efforts were noticed, and Heinz was offered the chance to join a class of 168 officers to attend a 3-year program at the War Academy in Berlin. He was moving fast, so much so that he earned the nickname Schneller Heinz or Quick Heinz. Although he did not see himself as particularly quick, Heinz did not like to rush mindlessly into action, often quoting a line by military leader Helmuth von Moltke. The line was, "First reckon, then risk." Heinz Guderian's studies were interrupted when 2 gunshots rang out in Sarajevo on the 28th of June, 1914. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which led to the outbreak of World War I in just a matter of weeks. With his radio qualification, Guderian joined the wireless communication staff. In November of 1914, he was promoted to first lieutenant, and only 1 year later, he was promoted to captain. His work allowed him to witness almost every front of the war, including the disaster on the Marne and the slaughter of Verdun. The carnage he viewed may have influenced his thoughts on developing mechanized warfare to protect the infantrymen and achieve a quick victory. He never had the chance to command a fighting unit, but his radio station, it sometimes came under attack, and he had to fight his way out. As a result, he was awarded the Iron Cross, 2nd and 1st class. In early 1918, he was tested at an advanced officer training program where he showed the ability for solving tactical problems with unusual actions. This impressed his instructors, who accepted his request to join the General Staff of the Army High Command. It is evident how the World War I experiences shaped Guderian's thoughts on Blitzkrieg and how they could improve it. His post in charge of radio communications taught him the importance of the wireless, especially when it came to coordinating the movements of separate infantry, artillery, and cavalry divisions. Although not directly involved, Guderian studied the tactics employed by the Stoßtruppen, also known as the shock troops or stormtroopers. These units were usually successful in infiltrating weak spots of enemy trenches to encircle, capture, or destroy command centers. But their successes were short-lived because of the limitations of, well, just being human. The extent of the advance of shock troops was limited by how fast and how far they could walk before succumbing to exhaustion. In many cases, capturing a well-stocked British or French position would mean failure, as shock troops would sit down to eat. Guderian's theories proposed to solve these limits by supporting infantry with mechanized and motorized units. They would require, in turn, the integration and coordination of separate arms at the lowest unit level in mutually supportive functions. In lay terms here, if you have a platoon of infantry, say 30 to 50 men fighting alongside a tank platoon, say 4 or 6 tanks, and they support each other, it is easier for them to cooperate rather than have a whole division of 15,000 foot soldiers on one side and a division of tanks on the other. Again, military friends, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think that's how it is. When the war ended in German defeat, the Treaty of Versailles allowed the country to maintain only a small army of 100,000 troops with no tanks or aircraft. Post-war Guderian served as an instructor teaching tactics and military history. It was during these years that he expanded, developed, and perfected his take on the idea of the war of movement. He would digest the works on mechanized warfare of British theorists Captain Liddell Hart and Major General Fuller. He began publishing articles in military journals and won a reputation for thinking clearly on controversial matters. In 1927, he was promoted to the rank of Major. His role was at the head of the command for all motorized transport units, and he also taught transport tactics at the Berlin Military Academy. Basically, his units were tasked with logistics and transport, not actual combat. But this did not prevent him from taking advantage and playing around with his trucks. He equipped some of these vehicles with wooden turrets armed with guns, and he moved them around a training ground as fighting units. His superiors were not happy, and they put an end to his experiments, but what he could not learn at home, well, he would learn abroad. In 1929, Guderian traveled to Sweden, where he visited a tank battalion, and then he went to Kazan in Russia. Here, he visited a secret tank testing facility that was co-developed by the Weimar Republic and the Soviet government. He also probably met Soviet tank commanders here who would later become his enemies. By 1933, when the Nationalist Socialist Party rose to power, Heinz was Colonel Guderian. Guderian continued with his articles about armored and motorized warfare and helped with solving technical problems of the 1st Panzer specimens. Guderian continued with his articles about armored and motorized warfare and helped with solving the technical problems of the 1st Panzer specimens. Guderian's theories would find fertile grounds with the Nazis and their rearmament policies. In early 1934, Guderian organized a demonstration of panzer tactics for Hitler. He later recalled, "The Chancellor was much taken by the speed and precision of movement of our units and said repeatedly, 'That's what I need.'" Hitler was ecstatic and would provide support to Guderian's innovation, even though the two men often clashed in spectacular shouting matches. Nazi leadership proceeded to reinstall conscription, thus ignoring the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler authorized another violation of the treaty that was the creation of 3 panzer divisions. Guderian was made the commander of the 2nd Panzer Division and shortly thereafter was promoted to Major General, then Lieutenant General in charge of the 16th Army Corps. In 1938, Guderian's units were the spearhead of the Anschluss with Austria and the invasion of the Sudetenlands, the German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. These were the years of appeasement, so the guns on his tanks, they were still silent. A few months later, Guderian was promoted to Commander-in-Chief of all the fast troops, or Schnellen Truppen, the perfect job for Schneller Heinz, if you will. He was now in charge of the recruitment, training, tactics, and technique for all motorized and armored units. A great leader and a poor follower, now Guderian would be able to bring the full weight of his studies, doctrine, and personality to the German panzer divisions. He could finally formalize and implement his take on the Blitzkrieg, which is: Number 1. Attacks should be led by large, concentrated numbers of tanks. Tanks should not be dispersed amongst other units like it was common practice in the British and the French armies at that time. As Guderian put it, you hit somebody with your fist and not with your fingers spread. Number 2. The infantry transported by trucks and half-trucks should closely follow the tank platoons to support them. This involves maintaining the logistics train, occupying positions, taking prisoners, neutralizing anti-tank weapons. Number 3. Aircraft and artillery are intended to support both tanks and infantry by striking at enemy armor and fortifications from above and from afar. Number 4. The units involved require a reliable means of communication. That involves connecting tanks via radio transmitters for coordinated joint action. To generate support for the Blitzkrieg, Guderian wrote and published his first book, Achtung, Panzer! And yes, that is how you pronounce it. The exclamation points are right there in the title. It's not Achtung Panzer, it's Achtung Panzer! The book became a military bestseller, essential reading for any officer. This book cemented Guderian's reputation as father of the Blitzkrieg, although it should be stressed again that these were not his original ideas. He had simply perfected and formalized concepts that were borrowed from German and foreign military strategists. An obscure French officer, a certain Charles de Gaulle, was already a proponent of mechanized war of movements in the 1920s, inspired by Polish officer Sikorsky. But in the end, what counts is not who theorizes, but who puts things into practice. In the book, Guderian summed up his thinking as such: deeds are more important than words. The goddess of battle will crown only the most daring with laurels. So this video, it talks a lot about Nazis, and even though it's not really about Nazis, it's about warfare, the chances of you actually seeing ads from YouTube on this video are pretty much nil. If you did see any ads on this video that is not this one for Vincero, it's just a demonstration of quite how strange the YouTube advertising algorithm is. I don't really know what's going on, but I really think it's unlikely you see anything. But anyway, sponsors like Vincero, they do make these videos possible, and if you want to support us and look great at the same time, you should get hooked up with a Vincero watch. Recently, I got this one. It's called a Rogue. I'll just take it off to show you guys. They sent me this last month. I went for black on black. I know this will be blurry. I'll just do some B-roll. You also have different strap options as well, so you can choose what strap you want to have with it. Previously, I had this one with a brown strap, which I think is cool. This one's called a Kronos, I think. Kronos, you got that marble thing in the back, blue back, silver outside, brown strap, magic of television, watch this. And then also, I got it with a black strap, so you got that black strap there. So see, you got lots of different options. I like the Rogue. The Rogue's perfect for summer because it's got this like rubber strap, so you're not going to be sweating into the leather, but you can swap that out if you want to. Right now, Vincero are actually having their biggest sale ever with huge discounts on their entire range. Both watches that you saw today are included, as is everything else. The sale only goes on to the 18th of August, and some watches will sell out, so better to have a look sooner rather than later. And please do go through the link in the description below. That helps support this show, or just go direct to vincerowatches.com/biographics. In September of 1939, Schneller Heinz was able to put his words into action during the aggression of Poland. Guderian was assigned to the 19th Corps, consisting of 1 panzer division and 2 motorized infantry divisions, which he led in an impressive drive against Polish defenses. But the real revolutionary actions took place during the Battle of France in the following year, when the Wehrmacht concentrated their armored division and the Luftwaffe at the Schwerpunkt, or main point of effort, achieving a decisive breakthrough against the Allies. The original plan for the invasion of France was a repeat of the Schleifen plan used back in World War I, a quick attack through Belgium and into northern France. But Hitler, he was not convinced. You won't get away with an operation like that twice running. Hitler demanded a new approach based on secrecy and surprise. The result was Operation Sickle Cut, devised by General von Manstein and Guderian. The idea was to lure French and British forces into Belgium and Holland by launching decoy attacks there, while the main thrust would be advancing through the Ardennes forest, considered too thickly wooded for tank operations. The success of this plan depended on concentration and coordination. The French had more and better tanks than the Germans, but their use was ruled by an outdated doctrine. They were thinly dispersed along the front, and they had few radios. Von Manstein instead had amassed 7 armored divisions at the spearhead of the Ardennes offensive. Guderian was in charge of 3 divisions, and he was ordered to cross the River Meuse at Sedan, where the Prussians had defeated Napoleon III in 1870. The day of the offensive arrived, the 10th of May, 1940. So did everything go as planned? Well, not really. The German divisions in the lowlands did manage to lure and pin down the Allies, but the swift drive through the Ardennes soon turned into a massive traffic jam. Allied aircraft could have easily destroyed the German column, but the Luftwaffe did its job and protected them from the air. The traffic cleared, and Guderian reached the Meuse 1 day earlier than planned. On the 13th of May, he had infantry and engineers cross the river in inflatable rafts so they could neutralize French bunkers and build pontoon bridges for the tanks. By nightfall, the defenders were routed. The French counterattacked the next morning, but Guderian, leading from the front, had made the snap decision to set up a defensive line with artillery. High Command ordered him to wait for reinforcements, but Guderian disobeyed and pushed ahead. Between May the 15th and the 17th, Guderian repulsed armored French attacks in the Stonne and Montcornet. This was not easy, though. Amongst his opponents was Brigadier General Charles de Gaulle, who almost managed to capture Guderian. As he remembered, his tanks succeeded in penetrating to within a mile of my advanced headquarters. This was Guderian's masterpiece. Operation Sickle Cut was a success beyond any expectations. This appeared too good to be true to High Command, which may explain their later cautiousness. By the 24th of May, the bulk of the British Expeditionary Force was encircled at Dunkirk, easy prey. But General von Rundstedt, Guderian's immediate superior, feared an Allied pincer movement and ordered that his panzers be stopped 10 miles from Dunkirk. Guderian was allowed to proceed only on the 26th, but by then the French had strengthened their defences around the Dunkirk pocket, allowing for the evacuation of the British. This surely frustrated Guderian, but overall his campaign was a success, resulting in the French surrender in June. Emboldened by the victories brought on by the War of Movement, Hitler started drawing plans to invade the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was launched in June of 1941, and Schneller Heinz was again to the fore. The campaign was nightmarish. As we now know, the army units were followed by the SS Einsatzgruppen, specially dedicated to rounding up, deporting, and murdering millions of Jews, Roma, and other targeted groups in Soviet territory. Guderian was leading Panzergruppe No. 2, headed towards Moscow in late 1941. Was he involved in these atrocities, or was he even aware? Evidence suggests that Guderian was not an anti-Semite. It is possible he knew that the Jews and other so-called undesirables were being sent to concentration camps for a life of hardship. And for sure he knew that his panzers had been built by slave laborers from occupied nations. But it might be that he didn't know about the systematic killings. Even his wife Gretel, a stronger admirer of Hitler's than Guderian's, later was shocked when she learned of the truth behind the camps. Both were convinced that Himmler and the SS were the only ones responsible, and not Hitler. If he somehow had no knowledge of the death squads, Guderian surely had realized by this time that Hitler was not a leader that he could follow blindly. As the Führer imposed ill-judged decisions on his generals, Guderian was frustrated by the lack of criticism. As the Russian campaign hardened, he wrote to his wife, "Everybody is scared of the Führer, and nobody dares say anything." As autumn and winter set in, Guderian's panzers stalled in the mud and the snow and were harassed by increasingly stiff Russian resistance. One of his most famous quotes is, "There are no desperate situations, there are only desperate people." And yet, this situation would prove desperate even to him. We have severely underestimated the Russians, the extent of the country, and the treachery of the climate. This is the revenge of reality. In December of 1941, Guderian defied an order from Hitler to advance on Moscow and instead pulled back his Panzergruppe 100 miles from the capital. This insubordination, it cost him his job. Hitler forced Guderian to retire, but rewarded him with a farm in Prussia. Countryside life, though, it did not sit well with Guderian, apparently. During this period, a pre-existing heart condition, it worsened. But he had no time to properly recuperate. He was soon going to be recalled back into service. In 1943, the situation for the Axis powers was worsening, and the military convinced Hitler that Guderian was needed. Hitler agreed, and he recalled Guderian from retirement, appointing him Inspector General of the Panzer Forces. This did not appease his temper, though, and his shouting matches with the Führer they resumed. In summer of 1943, he argued to contain Soviet counterattacks by a strategy of dynamic mobile defense. This would imply engaging the Red Army in a series of local clashes to defeat them in detail and delay their advance. The strategy was a contradiction of his beloved Blitzkrieg, but it just shows how he had realized that this was not a silver bullet that was suitable to all theaters of war. Hitler did not listen to his advice, though, preferring the proposal of General Zeitzler, and that was to concentrate all German armored divisions in Kursk to defeat the Soviets in one decisive battle. The Battle of Kursk raged on from the 4th to the 12th of July in 1943. It was a close call with heavy losses on both sides, but in the end, the Soviets prevailed, and from then on, the war on the Eastern Front, it became one of retreat for the Germans. The following year, after yet another suspension for insubordination, Guderian was approached by the circle of Colonel von Stauffenberg, who were plotting to assassinate Hitler. Guderian refused to participate, although he did not report the conspirators nor warn the Führer. The failed assassination, it took place on the 20th of July 1944, followed by a purge of military leadership. Ironically, now Guderian was one of the few remaining leaders that Hitler could trust for the war effort. The Führer appointed Guderian as the new Army Chief of Staff. Guderian's main focus now was to defend Germany from the impending Soviet counterattack and occupation. He knew very well that the war could not be won, but intended to resist as long as possible. The main hindrance to his plans was the meddling of the Führer himself. In March of 1945, he was vocally opposing Hitler in staff meetings. Hitler decided to get rid of Guderian and ordered him to take 6 weeks of sick leave. The order was meant to hurt him, but ironically, it might have saved him. Berlin would be surrounded by the Red Army the following month, while Heinz and Gretel were in a cardiology hospital in Munich. This is where US forces captured Guderian on the 10th of May 1945. It was the 5th anniversary of Operation Sickle Cut. Guderian was sent to Nuremberg, but was not immediately put on trial. The Russians wanted to charge him with war crimes, but the Western Allies didn't comply. In 1946, Guderian was imprisoned in the POW camps of Allendorf and Neustadt. During his captivity, Allied military tried to evaluate the extent of his involvement in the Nazi war crimes. As he did not cooperate with interrogations, they placed him in confinement with 2 other generals, Gier and Lieb, and wiretapped the cell. Even then, he kept his cards close to his chest. This is the only conversation in which he admits support of party policies. Gier. Any objective observer will admit that National Socialism raised the social status of the worker, and in some respects, even his standard of living, as long as that was possible. Lieb. This is one of the great achievements of National Socialism. The excesses of National Socialism were in the first and final analysis due to the warped personality of the Führer. Guderian. The fundamental principles were fine. It was not enough to charge him, and Guderian was released on his 60th birthday, the 7th of June, 1948. In the following years, he contributed to the organization of the Bundeswehr, the armed forces of West Germany. He returned to writing, drafting his memoirs and penning more military theory works. His autobiography, Panzerlieder, also known as Memoirs of a Soldier, was published in 1952, becoming an international bestseller. Soon after its publication, Guderian's health failed. He died in Schwangau bei Fussen on the 14th of May 1954, the anniversary of his victory on the Meuse. So far I've told you the most widely accepted version of Guderian's life story, the official version that's been held up for many decades after his death. However, in the 2000s, Guderian's career and legacy have come under scrutiny from several historians such as Russell Hart, Marcel Stein, or Pier Paolo Battistelli. These authors claim that Guderian's military capabilities were undeniable, although he greatly exaggerated them through his writings. Hart, for example, claims his victories always came from a position of strength and numerical superiority, never from a position of weakness. Battistelli argues that his true genius was as an author and as a publicist of his own image as the mastermind behind the Blitzkrieg. It can be argued that being in a position of strength is a sign of skill too, as it requires planning and preparation, and that autobiographies naturally tend to be embellished accounts. Other arguments are a little more disturbing though. Guderian always portrayed himself as distanced from Nazi excesses and as a fair combatant. Yet Marcel Stein writes that Guderian's units in Russia actively executed people under his orders, the infamous Commissar orders. This was the summary execution of war prisoners suspected to be political commissars or actively representing Bolshevik ideology. And that would be a war crime that would not be forgiven at the Nuremberg trials. Hart also claims that during the 1944 coup against Hitler, Guderian opportunistically played both sides, ready to join the winner to get a promotion as Chief of Staff. As acting Chief of Staff on the 29th of July, Guderian issued an order forcing all officers to become members of the Nazi Party, implying that he was closer to Nazi ideology than he would have us believe. I'm going to leave the final judgment up to you. Was Heinz Guderian a military genius loyal to his country, or a self-serving, opportunistic Nazi? Well, let us know in the comment section below what you think, and I really hope you did enjoy this video. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button, but even better than that, why not check out Vincero for a great watch, and it also helps support this show, so please consider doing that. And as always, thank you for watching.